Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In the last lecture we looked at the history of AWS. Now don't worry, the history of AWS is just to give you a bearing. It's to help you follow the AWS story. It's not going to come up in your exams. You're not going to be asked what year somebody wrote a white paper or anything like that. But it does give you a sense of where AWS has not only come from, but where it's also going. In the next few lectures, what we're going to look at is how AWS exists today. So we call this the 10,000 foot overview. We're going to look at every single service on the AWS platform as it exists today, post reInvent 2016. And basically, we're going to cover each service off briefly. Now, a lot of people freak out at this stage because there's so many different services, and especially if you're new to cloud computing or even to IT, it might seem a bit overwhelming. But the important thing to remember is when you're going into your exam, you actually only need to know a few core services in depth. The rest you might just need to have a high-level understanding of what it is, but almost like 80% or 85% of the services covered in the next few lectures won't even feature in the exam. So don't let it stress you out, but it is good always to have a good knowledge of AWS as a whole. So what we're going to do now, we're going to look at the differences between regions and multiple availability zones and edge locations. And then I'm going to cover specifically what services are going to be in your exam, what you're going to need to know in depth. And then we're going to go and have a look at every single other service, and I'll just give you a brief overview of what it is. Now, don't worry if you feel overwhelmed after watching these next few lectures. Every single person does it. AWS platform is vast and it's growing every single day. And you've got to keep in mind, like the solutions architects who work for AWS, they might have a very high overview of quite a few services, but they don't know every single service in depth. There is no such thing as the cloud guru. There's only such thing as a cloud guru. So don't worry. When you work with AWS, you should definitely specialize in specific services that will make you valuable to employers, but there's no way you can specialize in every single service, so don't let it stress you out. So let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, so when you first log into the AWS console, you'll get the following splash screen, and you can actually just view it by clicking on services as well if you get something more custom. And you can see up here the services are broken down into different areas. So we've got compute, we've got storage, we've got database, networking and content delivery, migration, developer tools, management tools, security, identity and compliance, analytics, artificial intelligence, IoT, game development, mobile services, application services, messaging, business productivity, and desktop and app streaming. So this is the way the console looks today. Obviously, over 2017, we're going to get new services that are added, and we might even get entirely new sections. Now, we do keep this course always up to date throughout 2017. Sometimes if a new service comes out and it's not relevant to the exam, I won't put it in the course. Remember, this course is designed to teach you how to pass your exam, whereas it's not supposed to teach you everything there is to know about AWS. If you want to learn everything there is to know about AWS, that's why we invented A Cloud Guru, the platform. So go check out our platform and you can do deep dive courses on individual services. So if your console does look a little bit different, all you need to do is just click on any kind of new service that you're interested in learning. So maybe it's a mobile hub, for example, and you can go ahead and read the splash screen. You can go get started with a new project and the wizards will start guiding you through it. Of course, you can always type into Google, what is mobile hub, etc. So that's the best way to learn. But remember, this course stays very focused on what is going to be covered in the exam so that you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours of endless reading about services you're not going to be quizzed on. Okay, so these are all the services we just saw in the console, and the only additional service is the one at the very bottom, AWS Global Infrastructure, which isn't a service, it's the actual physical infrastructure of Amazon Web Services. We're going to cover that off in the next slide. So there does seem to be an awful lot here, but what's actually relevant to the AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam? Well, actually, it's these services, and these are basically the services that you're going to need to know in order to pass your exam. Your messaging services you're going to need to know. Desktop and app streaming, you're only going to need to know at a very, very high level, specifically around workspaces. And we're going to cover off what that is later on in the course, but you don't really need to focus on that much at all. Security and identity access management, definitely you're going to need to know. Management tools, only as a little bit. Storage, databases, networking and content delivery, compute, and AWS Global Infrastructure is the bread and butter of the exam. So that's where we're really going to focus throughout this course. So let's go ahead and have a look at AWS Global Infrastructure to get started. So what is AWS Global Infrastructure? Well, it's the physical stuff that AWS runs on, and we really break it down into 3 different areas. We talk about regions, availability zones, and then edge locations. So let's start with regions. And a region is basically a place, in the world where AWS resources exist. Right now we have 14 regions, 38 availability zones, and a whole bunch of different edge locations. There's over 65 from memory. And basically, this changes all the time. There's always more regions and availability zones being added. You will never be quizzed in any exam how many regions or how many availability zones there are. So don't worry about it. If this comes slightly out of date throughout 2017, you're not ever going to be quizzed on it. So there will always be new regions coming. My prediction is new regions in Israel and South Africa, because that makes a lot of sense. It's going to fill that gap across the Middle East and Africa. I also have suspicions that there might be an Indonesian region simply because of the number of people out there as well. So what is a region and what's an availability zone? Well, a region is a geographical area. Each region consists of 2 or more availability zones. An availability zone is simply a data center. An availability zone could technically be a collection of data centers, but basically they're facilities that are very, very close to each other, and each availability zone is spaced, away from another availability zone. So if there's a flood in one area, let's say there's a flood in central Manhattan, and that might be one availability zone, and then the other availability zone might be in New Jersey. So they'll be close to each other, but they won't be, dependent on each other, and you keep latency quite low between the two. Let's go back to the first slide, and you can see for each region how many availability zones are in each one. So if we have a look at South America, for example, we can see that in that region we've got 3 availability zones. In Sydney, we've got 3 availability zones. In some regions in the world, such as India or Singapore, we've only got 2 availability zones. So an availability zone, just always think of it as a data center. Technically, it could be a collection of data centers, but just think of it as a logical data center. And then a region consists of a geographical area, and you're always going to have 2 or more availability zones in a particular region. So that is it. It's pretty simple. If you just remember a region as a geographical area and a availability zone as basically a data center, you'll be able to fly through the exam. So let's move on to edge locations. So what is an edge location? Well, an edge location is basically a content delivery network endpoint for CloudFront. If you don't know what a content delivery network is, don't worry. We're going to cover that off in the networking section of the course. But basically, it's a way to cache or to cache, depending on how you want to pronounce it, your very large media objects in the cloud. So things like video files or pictures, for example. If I was a user in New York and I want to download a video that's hosted, let's say, in Australia, on the very first occasion, it has to travel all the way across the world to me in New York, and then I have to download it. But the second time somebody in New York accesses it, it would be cached at a edge location in New York. So you'd only have to download it from a local server in New York. And that's basically how content delivery networks work. And we'll go through that in a lot more detail later on in the course. So there are many more edge locations than there are regions. Currently, there's over 66 edge locations around the world, and they're adding more edge locations all the time. They've actually added 16 since I last recorded this a year ago. So they do add edge locations as and when demand warrants it. Okay, so let's have a quick look at today's regions. So we'll start with North America. In North America, we've got 5 different regions. So it's one of the largest, and that makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because most of the customers are based in the United States. And then we've got a whole bunch of different edge location networks, places like Ashburn, Virginia, Atlanta, Chicago, etc. And these will be updated all the time. Again, you'll never be quizzed on this in the exam for you to identify regions. What you will need to do, though, is when we start logging into the console, is you'll need to choose a region that's nearest to you and start using that region. Some regions don't have services in them. Some regions won't have Lambda in them, for example. So if you are in a region and we're doing a lab and you can't see that particular service in your console, just change your region. And it's very simple to do. I'll show you how to do that later. In South America, we've only got 1 region currently, but we have 3 availability zones in that region. region. And then we have a whole bunch of different edge locations. In Europe, Middle East, and Africa, sometimes referred to as EMEA, we have 2 regions currently, which is in Ireland and Frankfurt. I like to work out of the Irish region because I'm based in London, so it makes a lot of sense for me in terms of latency, and the UK region will be coming online in the next 3 or 4 months, so around Q1 or the beginning of Q2 for 2017. And then we have a whole bunch of different edge locations around Europe, including the Netherlands, Berlin, Germany, Poland, Stockholm, etc., etc. You'll notice that currently there is no edge locations in Africa, which I've always found quite interesting, but I'm sure that will change coming into the future. In APAC, we've got 6 different regions currently. Tokyo and Sydney are by far some of the most popular regions right now. Seoul is relatively new, that's in South Korea, as well as Asia Pacific Mumbai region, that's also relatively new. That was launched not too long ago. And a big shout out to all our Indian students out there. You'd be surprised actually, the #1 students are American, and then it used to be UK students, but now it's actually Indian students. So we have more Indian students than we do have UK students. So it's great having a region in India now, because you've got really low latency when you're accessing your AWS resources. In terms of edge locations, we've got it in India, we've got Hong Kong, we've got Japan, we've got Korea, we've got Australia, basically everywhere in APAC apart from New Zealand, but hopefully that will be coming soon for all our New Zealand colleagues. And a big shout out to those people who work for Xero out in New Zealand. Okay, so we've covered off AWS Global Infrastructure. It's very simple to remember. It's just regions. A region's a geographical area. There are availability zones. Think of an availability zone as a data center, although it can comprise of multiple data centers in an availability zone, but each availability zone is isolated from another one. So if there's a flood in one, it won't necessarily affect the other, but you still have very low latency between the 2 or 3, or however many availability zones you have in a region. And then we have edge locations, and edge locations are basically points of presence for CloudFront. Now, let's move on to the services, and we'll start with network and content delivery. So, VPC, what is a VPC? VPC stands for Virtual Private Cloud, and just like we were talking about an availability zone being a physical data center, I want you to think of VPCs as a virtual data center. So you have a VPC in all the different regions around the world, and basically it's just a virtual data center where you're going to deploy your assets. You can have multiple VPCs per region, and you can even basically connect one VPC up to another. VPCs are such an important part of the exam. I cannot stress this enough. And we have 1.5 hours worth of content just on VPCs alone. And in order for you to successfully pass your exam, you're going to need to know how to build a VPC from memory. But don't worry, it is actually pretty simple. You just need the practice. There's nothing like getting your hands dirty when learning AWS, and the key to passing all the associate exams is to have a really good understanding of VPCs. So we'll come back to that later on in the course. It is quite an advanced topic. We're going to start off relatively easy. We're going to start off with identity access management first, because it's a pretty simple service, and we'll move on to VPCs later on in the course. Next of all, we have Route 53. Route 53 is Amazon's DNS service. So what do I mean by DNS service? Well, if you think about when you look somebody's name up in a phone book, basically you look up their surname to get their telephone number. DNS services work exactly the same way. So when you're looking up google.com, or you're looking up aws.com, or you're looking up acloud.guru, what you're actually looking up is the IP address for that computer, the public IP address. And that's what DNS is. So Route 53 is Amazon's DNS service, and you can actually register domain names through Route 53. We're going to look at Route 53 in quite a bit of detail later on in the course. And the reason it's called Route 53, by the way, is 53 is the DNS port. So when you're opening up DNS to the world, you do this on port 53. And of course, Route 66 is the first interstate across the United States. So they called it Route 53 after Route 66, but they just used the DNS port. And if you ever interview for a position with Amazon, that can actually come up as an interview question. So do remember that. Moving on to CloudFront. Now, CloudFront used to be in the storage section of AWS, but they moved it over to networking and content delivery now. So CloudFront, as we mentioned before, is part of the content delivery network, and it's just basically consists of like a whole bunch of different edge locations that will cache your assets, so cache things like videos or large media files, etc. We're going to look at CloudFront in actually the storage section of the course, but it is covered under the networking and content delivery section in the console. And then finally we have Direct Connect, and Direct Connect is a way of connecting up your Office or connecting up your physical data centers to AWS directly using a dedicated telephone line. So instead of going over the internet, you're going over a dedicated line into AWS. And there's a few reasons you want to do that. It might be around security, but most of the time it's because you need a very reliable internet connection because you're pushing a lot of data up to AWS and down from AWS, and then you would use Direct Connect. Direct Connect can come up in the exam, here and there. It's not a huge feature of the exam, but it can come up. It does feature very heavily in the Advanced Networking Specialty exam. EC2 stands for Elastic Compute Cloud, and I always get those two mixed up, whether it's Cloud Compute or Compute Cloud. But basically, all EC2 is virtual machines in the cloud, and that's what you would have been used to using if you come from a VMware background, or if you've been using any kind of virtualization technology. EC2 is simply the virtual machines that run on AWS. EC2 Container Services is basically a highly scalable, high-performing container management service that supports Docker containers, and it basically allows you to run applications on a managed cluster of Amazon EC2 instances, so basically on virtual machines, and it eliminates the need for you to install, operate, and scale your own cluster management infrastructure. Guess what? EC2 Container Services is not going to come up in the exam whatsoever. If you do want to learn about running Docker and using EC2 Container Services, sometimes referred to as ECS, on AWS, we do have an entire course on it, but it is not an exam related topic. Elastic Beanstalk, this is a great service. Basically, if you don't know anything about AWS and you want to deploy your code up into Amazon Web Services, you can actually just upload it to Elastic Beanstalk. Elastic Beanstalk will then have a look at your code, so it might be a PHP MySQL application, for example, and then it will go out and provision all the underlying infrastructure underneath it. Elastic Beanstalk comes up quite a bit in the developer exam. It doesn't come up too much in the solutions architecture exam, apart from knowing, basically just knowing what it is. Moving on to Lambda. Now, Lambda was announced at reInvent in 2014. It is basically one of the most revolutionary services of cloud computing. So with EC2, that's a virtual machine, and you would be able to access that virtual machine. You'd be able to log in using SSH or RDP if it was Windows, and you'd be able to, install things on there. So you have access to the operating system with EC2. Lambda is what we call serverless. So you don't actually go into the operating system. You don't do anything with the underlying host at all. What you do is you upload your code, and your code will then respond to events. And we will cover off Lambda in this course. It's still not in the exams. I still can't believe it because it is such a cornerstone of AWS. But I will go into Lambda in a little bit of detail in this course. I'll show you how to build out a skill using Amazon Echo, and that uses Lambda. And basically what you use Lambda for most commonly in terms of what we would use it as consumers is every time you speak to an Amazon Echo, or every time you speak to Alexa, you're actually speaking to Lambda. Lambda is speaking back at you, and it still blows my mind when you think about that. But Lambda is a very, very important topic in AWS. It does not yet feature at all in the exams. I expect that to change relatively quickly though, so you should at least have a very high level understanding of what Lambda is. And if you do want to learn more about Lambda, we have an entire in-depth course on it run by Ryan Brown. Moving on to Lightsail. Lightsail basically is a brand new service at reInvent 2016. It's basically out of the box cloud, so if you want a WordPress site or a Joomla site, for example, Lightsail will deploy that for you automatically. You then go in and customize it. It is such a new service that doesn't feature in the exam, and it's basically for people who don't know how to use AWS. Okay, so I don't want this lecture to go over 20 minutes, so that's it for this lecture, guys. You've been really patient. Go make yourself a tea or a coffee, have a break, and come back, and we will go on to the very next services. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.